So today, we're going to talk about one of the longest, bloodiest, and frankly most destructive conventional wars of the entire 20th century. That's the Iran-Iraq War. For 8 absolutely brutal years, these two neighbors were locked in a conflict that completely changed the Middle East forever.
Let's just start with a number. A number that's, well, it's pretty hard to even wrap your head around. Over $1 trillion. That's the low-end estimate for the combined financial cost of this war. This one figure tells you almost everything you need to know about the sheer scale of the devastation we're about to get into.
So what kicks off a war that lasts for 8 years and costs $1 trillion? Well, in this case, you had this perfect storm of old arguments, brand new, radical ideologies, and honestly, the massive egos of 2 incredibly powerful leaders.
And this slide really nails the core conflict. On one side, you've got Saddam Hussein's Iraq. He's all about secular Arab nationalism, a modern, non-religious state, and he wants to be the big boss in the Persian Gulf. Then, on the other side, you have Ayatollah Khomeini's brand new Islamic Republic of Iran, and they are fired up with revolutionary Shia Islam and a mission to export that revolution everywhere. I mean, these two ideologies couldn't be more opposed. They were on an absolute collision course.
Okay, so what lit the actual fuse? Well, you had a bunch of things. First, these old simmering fights over a really important waterway, the Shatt al-Arab. But the big one, maybe, was fear. Saddam, a Sunni ruling over a Shia-majority country, was terrified that Iran's revolution would inspire his own people to rise up. And then, he saw what he thought was a golden opportunity. Iran's military was a complete mess after the revolution. They'd gotten rid of thousands of their best officers. He thought, hey, this'll be easy, a quick win. Turns out, he was dead wrong.
All right, so let's get into the invasion itself and see how Saddam's big plan for a short, victorious war just completely and disastrously fell apart. So, Iraq rolls into Iran in September 1980, and at first, yeah, they're making ground, but then they get stuck. The Iranian resistance was way fiercer than they expected, especially in the battle for the city of Khorramshahr. That brutal fight bought Iran critical time, so much so that by June of '82, not even 2 years later, the tables had completely turned. Iran hadn't just stopped the invasion, they'd kicked the Iraqi army all the way back across the border.
And this right here, this is the pivot point of the whole war. With their country liberated, Iran gets a ceasefire offer from the UN and they say, no thanks. Instead, they go on the attack. They invade Iraq. The mission is no longer about defending their homeland, it's about toppling Saddam Hussein's government, period.
And if you want a perfect picture of just how much momentum Iran had at this moment, look at this number, 19,000. That's how many Iraqi soldiers just gave up and surrendered when Iran took back the city of Khorramshahr. I mean, can you imagine? For Iraq, it was a humiliating disaster. For Iran, it felt like proof they were winning.
But that momentum didn't lead to a quick victory. Instead, the war just grinds to a halt. It sinks into this long, horrible stalemate, a real war of attrition where neither side can land a knockout blow. All the while, outside powers are fueling the fire, because frankly, they're way more scared of Iran's revolution than they are of Saddam's ambition.
Honestly, the only way to really describe what this war became is to say it was a World War I-style nightmare. Just think of those old black and white photos. Endless trenches, barbed wire, guys going over the top into machine gun fire. That's exactly what was happening, but in the 1980s.
And the tactics, they just got uglier and uglier. You have the trench warfare we just talked about. Iran started using these horrifying human wave attacks to just overwhelm Iraqi guns. And in response, Iraq, which was being bankrolled by Gulf states and getting weapons from both the Soviets and the West, unleashed chemical weapons. And it didn't stop at the front lines either. Both sides started firing missiles at each other's cities and attacking oil tankers to try and bleed each other dry economically.
So let's talk about these human wave attacks, because they're one of the most infamous parts of this whole war. Iran had a bigger population, so they literally used people as a weapon. They'd send waves of lightly trained militia, often very young boys or old men, charging straight at fortified Iraqi positions. Their job was often just to clear minefields with their bodies or soak up bullets so that the more experienced troops could follow behind. The human cost was just unimaginable.
Right, so this fight wasn't just happening in the trenches. You had these other wars happening at the same time. The War of the Cities saw missiles like Scuds just slamming into civilian neighborhoods. And out in the Persian Gulf, you had the tanker war, where both sides were trying to wreck each other's economies by blowing up oil ships with things like French-made Exocet missiles. These things were terrifyingly effective and threatened to choke off a huge chunk of the world's oil supply.
So how does a nightmare like this finally end?
let's get into the final, violent stages of the war that broke this bloody stalemate and led to a peace that absolutely nobody wanted.
Okay, so fast forward to the spring of 1988. All that money and all those weapons that Iraq had been getting, they finally paid off. Big time. Iraq launched this series of massive, lightning-fast attacks. I mean, look at this timeline. In just a few short weeks, they took back every single piece of important territory that Iran had spent years and hundreds of thousands of lives to capture. The Iranian army just collapsed.
And we need to be brutally honest about how they did it. What was the secret weapon that finally broke the Iranian lines after all those years? It was poison gas. Iraq's massive and very well-organized use of chemical weapons was the decisive factor. It absolutely shattered Iranian morale in a way that nothing else had.
So, just as Iran is on the ropes militarily, something else happens that is just a total gut punch. An American warship, the USS Vincennes, mistakes a civilian Iranian airliner for a hostile fighter jet and shoots it down. All 290 people on board, men, women, and children, are killed. For the leadership in Iran, this was the final straw. The lack of any real international outrage, it felt like a clear signal that the entire world had turned against them.
And that brings us to this quote from Ayatollah Khamenei. It just says everything. Facing total military defeat, the constant threat of chemical attacks on his own cities, and feeling completely alone on the world stage, he finally agrees to a UN ceasefire. But listen to how he describes it. Drinking the poison chalice. That's not the language of a victor. That's the sound of bitter, absolute defeat.
So the fighting finally stops, but what's left behind? What is the real legacy of 8 years of absolute, unrelenting devastation?
Well, first, the human cost. And these numbers are just sickening. It's tough to get exact figures, but most estimates put the number of soldiers killed at around 500,000. Some say it could be as high as 1 million. And that's not even counting the hundreds of thousands more who were wounded, or the tens of thousands of civilians who died.
And the economic cost, remember that trillion-dollar figure we started with? Well, here it is again, a little more specific, over $1.1 trillion in combined losses. Both countries were left completely broke and saddled with massive debt, which would, by the way, directly lead to more conflict in the region just a few years later.
So let's just recap. 8 years of war, up to 1 million people dead, $1 trillion up in smoke. And for what? What was the grand result of all this horror? Absolutely nothing. It's what they call status quo ante bellum, a fancy Latin phrase that basically means things went right back to the way they were before the war started. The borders didn't move, not 1 inch.
And that just leaves you with this one final, haunting question, doesn't it? 8 years, 1 million casualties, $1 trillion. For what? It's hard to think of a more tragic and ultimately futile conflict in all of modern history.